I wanted to pick up on something Louise said to start, because I think what she said is really one of the big challenges we have with academic freedom, and it's us and our colleagues that are a big part of the problem, that people won't speak out, they don't speak out, and even those of us who have secure jobs don't often stand up and openly defend our interests. Sometimes we don't recognize our interests, but somehow part of the struggle we have, and a very big part of the struggle we have, I think, is to call on colleagues to actually get out there and defend the freedoms we have before they're all whittled away. You know, Jim talked about, and I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of assault on academic freedom in the universities, and that of course is true. But it's not only academic freedom in that sense, it's all kinds of freedoms. And I want to talk about today what I think is our blended environment for all of us as teachers. I know my students move between Seneca and York constantly, where we live in workplaces that look an awful lot alike in a lot of ways. And I want to talk a little bit about that overmanaged workplace and some of the academic freedom issues that it has brought to CAUT over the past year, and I think how it faces us with some of the challenges that we all face. So certainly both Constance and Jim and Louise too have talked a lot about changes in our institutions. But a couple that I would stress on top of that I think we've all seen is the absolute growth in the administrative apparatus. That's true for all of our institutions. And that growth has come alongside of things like activity-based budgeting, centralized budgeting that's now overtaking the academic missions and starting to interfere with our academic decision-making. Added to that, we talked about the Walmartization of the university, but in all of our institutions, what I'd like to underwrite there is how we used to be public space, but now we've become private space. We are a mall where customers, our students who become customers, can come in, but it is privately owned and managed. And neither we as teachers nor our students as customers are part of that owning and managing system. We also, I think, and you alluded to CG, but we also have more and more governance having to do with stakeholder governance, that awful word, and that includes private donors, right? Private donors are intruding, and CAUT has certainly had some very high publicity battles this year in two cases, actually, one in which we're still engaged, where donors have sought to have control over key academic things like hiring, things that they have no business being involved with. Casualization has been mentioned. But the last thing, and I think this is where we get into, are the hypersensitivity that our institutions have developed to their reputational gains, where all of us as teachers become kind of the new sales representative of the institution, right? We're part of the brand, and that's where the fight over extramural speech comes in, because they will go after us if we step out of the brand image. So performance reviews follow along with that, right? We've all seen heightened performance reviews, and of course the accountability regime that Constance has talked about. And so one of the things I want to talk about is how the issues get framed, and how then they get reframed. So what we're starting to see are issues that should be issues of freedom, reframed under the name of safety. Harassment-free. Equity, they're often run by equity offices. Inclusion has been neatly appropriated to become anything but inclusive. And this is a way that we're seeing management rights extended through a whole proliferation of policies. And particularly, I'd like to signal here things like respectful workplace policies, civility policies. Anytime you hear the word civility, respect, be very wary, I think, and we need to make sure that we get into our collective agreements. There's something that, it is the thing that will take away our freedom in the universities, academic freedom, colleges and universities, expressive freedoms, is things around respect and civility. So at King's College, Western University, a recently retired sessional faculty member, wrote a passionate letter to an administrator, a dean, I believe, raising issues that concerned him about a program. He was involved in a program that he dearly loved, had served for many years, and he wrote a passionate letter and said, you know, I have real worries about how my colleagues are taking up this fight. I have worries about this colleague. I don't think that their motivation is the right one. And he found himself suddenly charged with having violated a respectful workplace policy, having been uncivil. And the incivility was said to have made other people feel unsafe. That person found himself permanently banned from campus. And that should be a lesson to all of us around that one. Another similar example, again using respectful workplace ideas. At Brock University, a group that includes a few students, faculty, and even somebody who was at that point administrator, voiced their concern about a Brock-sponsored program that was associated with a Brotherhood of the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church. And they raised the question in the normal sense that you would raise a question. They raised the question about whether it was appropriate for Brock University to sponsor a program like this, to sponsor a religiously based program. And they found themselves subject to a complaint under the respectful workplace language. Now, the key thing, I'm just going to grab my water. I think what's so important about these cases is that in these cases, these procedures, and you may recognize some of these procedures, they talk about confidentiality. And they explain that confidentiality is necessary to keep everybody's reputation, blah, blah, blah. So nobody can speak. But the thing about confidentiality and the way it's getting increasingly used is that it puts a cone of silence over everybody, often for very lengthy periods of time, because these sorts of complaints can go on for a year or more. So no one can talk about an issue. So associations, no one knows who to go to. In this case, the faculty were quite simply just deserted. They felt isolated. They were just dumped, not knowing who to talk to, not knowing where to go, because they were told everything's confidential. So confidentiality takes another part of this twist. And I think it can carry on for long enough that it creates, even in this case, that there are rights to grieve and arbitrate, and CAUT is involved, and we're all moving ahead, but it creates a real problem when you can't communicate. And in this case, it was particularly bad because the complainants were in the press talking about the issue, but the employees had no outs. So I think we have to be very alert to all of these kinds of programs. And I notice in the kit we have some language from Conestoga that should make everybody sit up and ears prick up, and we should talk about that language because it's really worrying. As it's obviously been recognized. Another set of policies, space booking policies, and these are the policies that go after all of our freedoms. Universities, colleges, we've all become private spaces, and space booking policies are used to effectively criminalize protest, criminalize demonstrations. They are absolutely antithetical to spontaneous speech and to the kinds of democratic rights we all need to have, and the encouragement for vigorous debate. You know, every institution now will have on its site, you know, we encourage vigorous debate. We all encourage vigorous debate and dissent, but somehow there's nowhere to have it. There's no space left at many of our institutions where you can actually have that, except for our anodyne senates, which don't involve many of us. So at York University this spring, the university, because there was a spontaneous speech event, there was a demonstration, York University has withdrawn official recognition from the student group who, I gather, sponsored the demonstration, which was the Students Against Israeli Apartheid, and issued letters of discipline to 5 other student groups. So this is something that I think, this is where teachers need to join with students, and we haven't done a very effective job at that, I have to say. But that's a concern. Student codes of conduct, and I'm sure Alistair will have something to say about that, or another, like respectful workplace policies, we should be very concerned about. Our universities, colleges are also using the law more and more to underline private property. They're issuing trespass notices to people they don't want on their private property or in the mall. At Western University, an independent journalist was banned for a year for participating in a silent demonstration on campus. At my own university this year, a York alumnus who was also working on the York campus has been banned for a similar offense, in this case using an amplification device during a demonstration, and threatened with criminal trespass if he's seen on the campus for 1 year. Another example is we move from space. We also see how, I was talking earlier about saving reputations, how all of our institutions are increasingly concerned with their reputations and failing completely to protect the reputations of the teachers in their institutions. At this year, and some of you will have read about this, Dale Askey, a librarian at McMaster University, has a private blog, and he wrote in that private blog some views about Edward Mellon Publishing. And he said he wasn't very impressed, among other things. And he promptly found himself and his university sued for this, sued for a great deal of money. And it took CAUT intervention and a vast campaign by librarian groups across the country to ensure that his university did eventually do the right thing and come to his support. Finally, I'd like to say something that concerns all of us, I know, and that's about academic freedom in the classroom. And a few years ago, the American Association of University Professors did a little study of what were the kinds of threats to academic freedom in our classrooms. And they found 4 key kinds of issues coming up, and I'd be interested to hear whether they resonate for you. They certainly did for me. And they found 4 key threats that were coming up. And first was the idea that we need to provide balanced teaching. This is like the CBC, right? If you get anybody mildly progressive, then you get a far right winger to speak. It reduces, of course, calling for balance reduces the idea of the freedom to teach to the freedom to teach without any commitment. The second thing they found was the accusation that teachers were indoctrinating their students. In this case, this was a North Carolina case, I believe, where somebody had assigned Barbara Ehrenreich's nickeled and dimed, not getting by in America, and was accused of indoctrination. Third, they found that teachers were creating a hostile climate through introducing controversial matter that might offend something. It might offend a cherished belief that a student had. And finally, they found that people were being accused of, and this was particularly from the Students for Academic Freedom, what they called persistent irrelevance. That is, if you're teaching a course on, if you're not teaching a course on American presidents, then you shouldn't be mentioning the Bush policies, which was the era they were looking at it in. So we shouldn't talk about our current government unless we're teaching a course on government. And you know, at the time, when I first read this report a while ago, I didn't bring it with me last year because I thought, oh, it's so American. And it is American, and the findings are particularly American, but I just wanted to tell you about one case we've dealt with recently, or a couple of them actually, that I think resonate in the same kinds of ways about balance. This past year at Queen's University, a professor was disciplined for having failed to create a safe space in his classroom and to have failed to foster inclusivity by reading passages from texts like Hansard in the early 20th century that for some students contain very offensive language. And there's an account of this case in the CUT website. So he disciplined, and eventually there was a very large and public pushback on this case, and I'm not quite clear where it's gone, if anywhere, but there was, Jim, you might have.
Yeah, this was a guy who was teaching a course in post-colonial history. He retired as a professor at Concordia. Queens had talked him into, he moved to Kingston, and they talked him into offering one course on post-colonial history. He did it sessional. He retired permanently. The guy who replaced him got a big grant, research grant, so that's exactly what was the year. He was giving an illustration, he's kind of saying, of how colonial mentality can be harmful. And he quoted from the trial of the admiral in charge of Pearl Harbor, because the Americans actually knew ahead of time that the Japanese were going to attack. And the admiral's court-martial didn't do anything. He quoted the admiral's testimony, saying, "We would have thought those yellow state Jack actions would have been harm the United States, so we just ignored it." And he had a similar quote saying it continues to stay in Afghanistan. So the chair limited in the classroom, of course, right. The head of the university supported the chair, the head of the university is a very distinguished historian. The faculty association agreed because this guy was in his medicine, this developed some serious health problems and putting through observations, but he wasn't coming back anyway. So that's what we felt publicly. So where it stood, and this is a wonderful story, where it stands is we set up a committee requiring the report and publish it fully dedicated to him going out to the university progressively. And the man in the university apologized, the president of the university said, hell no. So it's what? A couple hundred faculty and librarians wrote an apology letter and said, we the faculty and librarians are the university and we're apologizing.
Yeah, thank you. And my very last case is a very recent one, which was at the Alberta College of Art and Design, where as part of a class project, a student carried out a piece of performance art that involved a chicken, and the professor was immediately fired on the grounds that they had shocked people, and inappropriately shocked people.
And harmed the reputation of the Alberta College of Art.
Yes, so harm the reputation. So again, I mean, I think the thing is that, as Jim pointed out in his talk, there is absolutely, it is so important that we have the means to grieve and arbitrate these kinds of egregious violations, but equally important is the political campaign around it, that we stand up and we get people out and we struggle around them, because there is a wave, I think, of really moving to control our freedoms generally, as well as academic freedom, but academic freedom in particular, across our systems. So I think we have to really keep struggling against that. So thank you.